There are places in the galaxy where reality itself has given up, where the laws of physics bow to the whims of entities that feed on your suffering, and where your soul becomes currency for beings that have existed since before humanity learned to fear the dark. If you want to explore the most terrifying locations in the Warhammer 40K universe, subscribe to this channel as we journey into nightmares that make the Horus Heresy look like a minor disagreement. The first time you see a Daemon World through a viewport, your mind tries to reject what your eyes are showing it. The planet shouldn't exist according to any understanding of astrophysics or orbital mechanics. It hangs in space like a wound in reality, sometimes rotating in directions that shouldn't be possible, occasionally existing in multiple locations simultaneously, always radiating a wrongness that makes your soul itch. Captain Herodis Varn of the Imperial Navy had served for 37 years before he saw his first Daemon World. He had fought against orc invasions, Tyranid hive fleets, and chaos raiders across a dozen sectors. He considered himself a veteran, a man who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and survived with his sanity intact. He was wrong. The world designated as Plague Garden 7 appeared on the surveyor screens like a cancerous growth, its surface readings fluctuating between temperatures that should have boiled away its atmosphere and cold that should have frozen it solid. The ship's machine spirit kept trying to delete the data as erroneous, unable to reconcile the contradictory information with its programmed understanding of reality. Varn made the mistake of looking at the planet through the observation deck's reinforced windows. Even from orbital distance, even through layers of armored glass and void shields, the world's nature was apparent. The surface wreathed with movement that was neither geological nor meteorological, patterns that suggested thought and purpose behind every shift and change. The planet was alive, and it was watching them. His second mistake was ordering a closer scan. The surveyor probe descended through an atmosphere that was more soup than gas, thick with compounds that shouldn't exist and organisms that violated every principle of biology. The readings it transmitted back before contact was lost painted a picture of a world that had been fundamentally rewritten by forces that cared nothing for natural law. Varn's third and final mistake was authorizing a landing party. The 12 soldiers who boarded the Valkyrie were the best his ship had to offer. Veterans of 100 boarding actions, men who had faced death without flinching and emerged victorious more times than they could count. They descended through the poisonous atmosphere with their rebreathers sealed and their lasguns ready, professional soldiers executing a routine reconnaissance mission. None of them came back sane. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened to those men, you need to understand the nature of Daemon Worlds and the dark powers that create them. You need to understand that there are 4 primary types of these hellscapes, each one a reflection of its patron god's particular obsessions, each one designed to harvest souls in ways specifically tailored to exploit humanity's deepest weaknesses. Let's start with the worlds claimed by the blood god, the brass throne that towers over mountains of skulls, the entity that whispers in the hearts of every warrior who has ever felt the thrill of violence. Khorne's Daemon Worlds are the simplest to understand and the most immediately lethal. They exist for one purpose: endless war. Reality on these planets has been restructured around the fundamental concept of violence, every aspect of the environment weaponized in service to eternal conflict. The world called Crucible of Skulls had once been an agri world, a peaceful colony that fed 3 surrounding systems with its abundant harvests. Then the planet's governor made a deal he thought would save his people from an orc invasion. He offered prayers to the god of war, promised skulls for the throne if only his world would be spared from the greenskin hordes. The prayers were answered, but not in the way he expected. The orcs never reached Crucible of Skulls. They were intercepted in the outer system by a warp storm that shouldn't have been there, pulled screaming into the immaterium where daemons tore them apart with gleeful violence. The governor celebrated his victory, never noticing that the prayers had continued even after his conscious intention had stopped. The change began slowly. Arguments became fights. Fights became murders. Murders became massacres. Within 6 months, the entire planet was at war with itself, every surviving human locked in perpetual combat that never ceased and never concluded. Cities became fortresses, fields became killing grounds, and the sky bled red with the reflection of endless carnage. When the warp finally consumed the planet completely, dragging it into the immaterium and spitting it back out as something else, Crucible of Skulls had been fundamentally transformed. The planet's very geology had restructured itself into natural fortifications and killing fields, mountains rising into jagged blade, like peaks, valleys becoming natural amphitheaters for combat. The atmosphere itself had become weaponized. Every breath filled the lungs with rage, chemical compounds that shouldn't exist triggering aggression centers in the brain with surgical precision. Peace became physically painful. Inaction a torment worse than injury. The only relief came through violence, through the act of taking life and spilling blood. The native population had been transformed as well. Those who survived the initial descent into madness were no longer fully human, their bodies warped by Khorne's influence into killing machines optimized for eternal war. They fought not for territory or resources or any rational objective, but for the simple joy of combat, for the ecstasy of murder, for the brief moment of connection with their patron god that came with each kill. Imperial forces discovered Crucible of Skulls during a routine patrol sweep. The initial scouting reports seemed almost mundane, a planet showing signs of civilization but not responding to hails. Standard procedure called for an investigation team to determine if the world had been lost to Xenos raiders or simply suffered communications failures. The investigation team consisted of 50 Imperial guardsmen from the Cadian 117th, veterans who had survived the fall of Cadia itself and been reformed into a new regiment. They were led by Colonel Marcus Brennan, a man whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his devotion to the Emperor. They landed expecting to find scared civilians or perhaps evidence of an orc incursion. Instead, they found hell. The landing site was a valley that had once been farmland, now transformed into a landscape of scattered weapons and bleached bones. The bones were recent, still showing signs of flesh and sinew, arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic significance. Skulls had been stacked into pyramids, their empty eye sockets all facing toward the center of the valley. Colonel Brennan ordered a defensive perimeter established, following doctrine despite the crawling sensation at the back of his neck that warned him something was terribly wrong. The guardsmen deployed with professional efficiency, setting up heavy weapons positions and establishing fields of fire that would give them advantage against any conventional attack. The attack, when it came, was anything but conventional. They emerged from the ground itself, bursting up through soil that had been solid moments before. Humans, or things that had once been human, covered in ritual scars and brass icons, wielding weapons that ranged from sophisticated plasma guns to crude clubs fashioned from thigh bones. Their eyes burned with mindless rage, their mouths opened in screams that echoed within human harmonics. But what made them truly terrifying wasn't their appearance or their weapons. It was their absolute fearlessness, their complete disregard for self-preservation in pursuit of violence. They charged into lasgun fire without flinching, absorbed wounds that should have been instantly fatal, and kept fighting even after losing limbs or suffering injuries that should have incapacitated them. The battle lasted 6 hours, 6 hours of continuous combat without pause or respite, 6 hours during which the guardsmen killed hundreds of attackers and watched in horror as hundreds more kept coming. The dead were dragged away by their fellows and butchered on crude altars, their skulls added to the pyramids while their blood soaked into ground already saturated with the vital fluids of thousands of previous victims. Colonel Brennan watched his soldiers die one by one, pulled down by sheer weight of numbers or making fatal mistakes as exhaustion degraded their combat effectiveness. He watched his best sergeant, a woman who had survived 30 years of warfare across a dozen campaigns, suddenly drop her lasgan and charge into the enemy lines with a knife. Screaming prayers to the blood god, she killed 3 attackers before being torn apart. The corruption had already begun. The atmosphere's chemical compounds were doing their work, rewriting neural pathways and triggering aggressive responses that bypassed conscious control. Brennan could feel it himself, the rising tide of irrational anger, the increasing difficulty of maintaining tactical discipline when every instinct screamed at him to charge forward and kill. Only 12 guardsmen made it back to the Valkyrie. Brennan wasn't among them. His final Vox transmission, recorded by the ship's cogitators, consisted of 6 words repeated over and over: blood for the blood god, blood for the blood god, blood for the blood god. The 12 who escaped didn't survive long. The corruption had already taken root in their minds, the rage building slowly but inexorably. Within hours of returning to orbit, they had turned on each other, the ship's corridors running with blood as former comrades fought to the death over imagined slights and trivial disagreements. But Khorne's worlds, for all their immediate horror, are at least straightforward in their malevolence. You know what you're facing: endless violence, corruption through rage, death through combat. The threat is obvious, the danger clear. The worlds claimed by the architect of fate are far more insidious. Tzeentch's Daemon Worlds are places where reality has become negotiable, where cause and effect are suggestions rather than laws, where your own thoughts become weapons turned against you. They are labyrinths of impossible geometry and paradoxical physics, places where knowledge is both the key to survival and the guarantee of damnation. The world designated as Paradox Prime had been a research colony, home to some of the Imperium's most brilliant scientists and theoreticians. They studied ancient Xenos artifacts and forbidden technologies, walking the dangerous line between innovation and heresy. For centuries, they maintained that balance, making discoveries that advanced Imperial understanding without crossing into forbidden territory. Then one of them found a text that shouldn't have existed, a manuscript that claimed to contain the fundamental equations underlying reality itself. The scientist who discovered it, a woman named Dr. Yelena Kroos, recognized immediately that the mathematics were beyond anything humanity had achieved. They were elegant, beautiful, seemingly complete. They were also alive. The equations began to propagate through the research colony's data networks, copying themselves into every cogitator and machine spirit they encountered. The scientists tried to study them, to understand their structure and implications. Each scientist who read the equations understood them differently, saw different patterns and different meanings in the same symbols. Arguments began about interpretation. Debates became heated, then violent, as researchers insisted that their understanding was correct and all others were dangerously mistaken. The colony's unified scientific community fractured into dozens of competing factions, each claiming unique insight into the equation's true meaning. Reality began to reflect those competing interpretations. In the Western research complex, Dr. Kroos and her followers believed the equations proved that consciousness created reality through observation. The universe, they argued, was nothing more than information processing itself, and by understanding the underlying code, one could rewrite reality itself. Their section of the colony began to change in response to their beliefs. Walls became transparent, then translucent, then started shifting between solid and gaseous states, depending on whether anyone was looking at them. Laboratory equipment functioned according to the scientists' expectations rather than physical laws, experiments succeeding or failing based on the researchers' confidence rather than proper methodology. In the Eastern complex, a rival faction led by Dr. Marcus Thorne had reached different conclusions. They believed the equations proved that reality was cyclical. That time was not linear but recursive, that every moment existed simultaneously with its past and future states. Their section of the colony became unstuck in time. Researchers encountered younger versions of themselves working on experiments they wouldn't conceive for years. Equipment aged and de-aged randomly. Brand new instruments suddenly ancient and corroded, century-old artifacts pristine as the day they were forged. People began living their lives backwards, remembering events that hadn't happened yet while forgetting their own pasts. The southern complex developed its own interpretation, and the northern, and dozens of smaller facilities scattered across the planet's surface. Each group's beliefs shaped reality around them, creating pockets of impossible physics that expanded slowly, inevitably, until they began to overlap. When different interpretations of reality collided, the results were catastrophic. Walls existed and didn't exist simultaneously. Time flowed forward and backward and sideways all at once. People found themselves split across multiple possible timelines, each version experiencing a different outcome of the same events, all simultaneously aware of their parallel selves and slowly going mad from the cognitive dissonance. The warp-consumed Paradox Prime during what the Imperials later designated as a chronological paradox event. The planet was pulled into the immaterium not all at once but sequentially, over the course of 300 years that happened simultaneously. It was destroyed, preserved, transformed, and reborn in the same instant that stretched across centuries. When it emerged from the warp, Paradox Prime had become a monument to Tzeentch's obsession with change, knowledge, and impossible complexity. The planet existed in 9 dimensions simultaneously, its surface a constantly shifting maze of architecture that rewrote itself according to rules that changed by the moment. Time flowed in directions that shouldn't exist. Causality had become entirely optional. And every observer saw something different when they looked at the world. The Inquisition discovered Paradox Prime when one of their deep space monitoring stations detected temporal anomalies emanating from the planet's location. Inquisitor Helena Martikov, a specialist in chrono heresy and paradox investigations, led the expedition to investigate. Martikov was brilliant, careful, and utterly certain of her ability to resist corruption through faith and discipline. She had investigated 17 temporal anomalies during her career, always maintaining perfect mental clarity and doctrinal purity. She was proud of her perfect record, her unwavering resistance to the temptations of forbidden knowledge. Pride, it turned out, was exactly the weakness Tzeentch had been waiting to exploit. The investigation team materialized in orbit above Paradox Prime using a specialized teleportarium designed to pierce temporal distortions. They appeared on the planet's surface, or what passed for a surface in the conventional sense, in a chamber that was simultaneously vast and tiny, ancient and newly built, empty and filled with impossible machinery. Martikov activated her chronometer, intending to establish a baseline temporal reference that would help them navigate the distorted timescape. The chronometer's display showed 6 different times simultaneously, all of them correct, all of them mutually contradictory. The investigation proceeded according to protocols Martikov had developed over decades of similar operations. Document everything. Trust nothing. Maintain mental discipline. Resist the temptation to understand what should remain mysterious. But Paradox Prime was designed to defeat exactly those strategies. They encountered the first survivors 3 hours into their investigation, or perhaps 3 days, or 3 minutes, temporal measurement having become increasingly unreliable. The survivors were research staff from the original colony, still alive centuries after the planet's transformation but no longer entirely sane. One of them, a man who identified himself as Dr. Khorne, though he appeared to be in his 20s, despite claiming to be 400 years old, explained what had happened to the colony. He spoke backwards, his sentences finishing before they began, his words arriving in reverse order but somehow remaining comprehensible. The equations were a gift, he said, a revelation of how reality truly functions beneath its superficial stability. We thought we were learning to read the universe's source code. We didn't understand that the code was reading us, categorizing us, determining our suitability for transformation. Martikov listened with growing horror as Khorne described how the surviving colonists had been systematically altered by their exposure to impossible knowledge. Their minds had been upgraded, or downgraded, or sidegraded, direction having lost meaning in this context, to process information in ways that human neurology was never designed to accommodate. They could perceive time non-linearly, seeing cause and effect as a unified whole rather than sequential events. They could observe multiple possible futures simultaneously, watching different versions of reality branch and converge. They could remember things that hadn't happened yet and forget things that were currently occurring. The gift of such perception came with a terrible cost. They could no longer function in normal reality. The linear progression of time that baseline humans took for granted had become incomprehensible to them, as alien and disturbing as their non-linear perception would be to normal people. They were trapped on Paradox Prime, unable to leave because any world operating under conventional physics would drive them insane with its rigid, inflexible temporality. "But you can understand," Khorne said, his eyes bright with manic enthusiasm. "You're smart enough, disciplined enough, faithful enough to process the equations without losing yourself. I can show you. I can teach you to see what we see." Martikov should have refused immediately, should have recognized the obvious temptation for what it was. But her pride intervened, whispering that she was different from the colonists, stronger, more resistant to corruption. She had resisted 17 other temptations, after all. Surely she could look at these equations without falling to their influence. She accepted Khorne's offer. The equations, when she finally saw them, were nothing like she expected. They weren't written in any conventional mathematical notation, weren't expressed as numbers or symbols that could be transcribed and analyzed. Instead, they existed as pure concepts that her enhanced mind, the product of decades of neural conditioning and pharmaceutical augmentation, could perceive directly. And they were beautiful. More than beautiful. They were right in a way that nothing else had ever been right. Every question she'd ever had about the nature of reality found its answer in those elegant conceptual structures. Every mystery that had frustrated her throughout her career suddenly made perfect sense. She understood, in that moment of revelation, why the colonists had embraced transformation rather than resisting it. Knowledge of this magnitude couldn't be unlearned, couldn't be ignored or suppressed. Once you understood how reality truly functioned, returning to ignorant simplicity became impossible. The investigation team found Martikov 3 days later, sitting motionless in the chamber where Khorne had shown her the equations. She was still alive, still breathing, but her mind had departed on journeys through time and possibility space that her body couldn't follow. When they tried to speak to her, she responded in sentences that hadn't been written yet, answering questions that wouldn't be asked for hours or days. Her reports on the investigation were comprehensive and detailed, covering events that were still in the future from the team's perspective, but already past from hers. They extracted her from Paradox Prime and attempted to return her to normal Imperial space. But the transition proved catastrophic. Exposed to linear time after days of non-linear perception, Martikov's consciousness fractured across multiple timelines. She experienced every possible outcome of her life simultaneously, living and dying and never having existed all at once. The Inquisition declared her a casualty of temporal corruption and purged her from all records. Standard procedure for cases where an Inquisitor's very existence had become paradoxical. Officially, Helena Martikov had never investigated Paradox Prime, had never seen the equations, had never achieved the terrible enlightenment that destroyed her. Unofficially, 9 different versions of her still exist on Paradox Prime, each one trapped in a different temporal loop, each one trying desperately to warn her past self not to look at the equations, each one failing because her past self's pride makes her certain she'll be different. But if Khorne's worlds kill you and Tzeentch's worlds drive you mad, the worlds claimed by the Plague God offer something arguably worse survival. Nurgle's Daemon Worlds are places where death has been defeated, where decay has become eternal, where suffering continues forever because the mercy of final cessation has been removed from the equation. They are gardens of disease and mutation, places where life persists in forms so twisted and agonizing that extinction would be preferable. The world called Plague Garden 7, the same world that Captain Varn had ordered investigated, had once been a paradise. A pleasure world where the wealthy elite of a dozen systems came to relax in carefully maintained environments, enjoying luxuries that most Imperial citizens would never experience. The planet's atmosphere was perfectly balanced, its climate optimized for human comfort, its ecology designed by master geneticists to be beautiful, peaceful, and safe. Then the plague ships arrived. They came from the outer dark, vessels that should have been destroyed millennia ago, still somehow limping through the void. Their hulls were covered in growths that might have been vegetation or might have been flesh, pulsing with diseased life. They broadcast no identification codes, responded to no hails, simply drifted into orbital positions and began releasing their cargo. The first spores reached the surface within hours. They were microscopic, engineered with malevolent genius to bypass standard decontamination protocols and immune system responses. They drifted down through the atmosphere like invisible snow, settling on everything they touched. The infection began slowly. A few people developed what seemed like minor rashes, easily treated with standard medical care. But the treatments didn't work. The rashes spread, became lesions, began weeping fluids that were themselves infectious. Within days, thousands were sick. Within weeks, millions. The planetary government tried to contain the outbreak, imposing quarantines and deploying military forces to enforce isolation protocols. But the disease was too virulent, too aggressive, too perfectly designed to spread despite any precautions. It leaped from person to person through air and water and physical contact, through vectors that shouldn't have been possible. More horrifying than its contagion, however, was what the disease did to its victims. It didn't kill them. That would have been merciful. Instead, it transformed them, rewrote their biology at the cellular level, turned them into living incubators for new strains of infection. Their bodies became gardens where diseases bloomed like flowers, each victim hosting dozens of different plagues that coexisted in impossible biological harmony. Their flesh rotted but remained alive, green with decay but still functioning. Their organs failed but continued working through mechanisms that violated every principle of medicine. Their minds deteriorated but retained enough consciousness to experience every moment of their transformation. And through it all, they felt no pain. That was Nurgle's gift, his blessing to his chosen followers, the removal of suffering even as the body fell apart. The victims of Plague Garden 7 experienced their transformation with numb acceptance, then gradual contentment. Finally active joy as they embraced their new nature. They became plague bearers, missionaries of disease who welcomed their condition and sought to share it with others. The military forces sent to contain them were infected and converted, joining the growing armies of the diseased. The wealthy elite who had come to the planet for luxury found themselves transformed into bloated, pestilent mockeries of their former selves, their perfect bodies ruined but their minds content with their new state. When the warp finally claimed Plague Garden 7, the transformation was almost anticlimactic. The planet had already become a Daemon World in all but technicality, its population converted, its ecology transformed into a garden of supernatural plagues. The transition to full Daemon World status simply made official what was already reality. The Imperial Navy discovered the transformed Plague Garden 7 during Captain Varn's patrol sweep. Standard surveyor readings indicated a formerly Imperial world, now showing signs of massive contamination. Protocol called for investigation to determine whether the world could be reclaimed or needed to be subjected to exterminatus. Varn, as mentioned earlier, made the fatal mistake of ordering a closer look. The 12 soldiers who descended to the planet's surface were equipped with the best protective gear the Imperial Navy could provide. Sealed environment suits with multiple redundant air supplies, biological filters capable of screening out any known pathogen, chemical sensors that could detect contamination at parts per billion concentrations. None of it mattered. The first soldier to be infected, Sergeant Halikos Tarn, later described the experience in a rambling testimony recorded before he was mercifully executed. The infection entered through his suit's air supply, bypassing filters that should have stopped anything organic. He felt nothing at first, no indication that anything was wrong. Then, slowly, he began to notice changes. His suit's internal temperature felt slightly warm. His breathing seemed slightly labored. Minor discomforts that could be explained by stress or fatigue or the simple challenges of operating in a hostile environment. By the time he realized something was seriously wrong, the infection had already spread throughout his body. The squad's medicus specialist tried to treat him, but the standard anti-pathogen protocols had no effect. The disease wasn't responding to any known medication, wasn't even being slowed by compounds that should have killed any biological agent. It simply ignored the treatments and continued spreading, following its own mysterious agenda. Tarn watched his hands swell and discolor, the flesh turning green, gray with decay. He could see the bones through his skin as the tissue became transparent, could see his own tendons and muscles working as his fingers moved. The sight should have been horrifying, but he felt only fascination, a detached curiosity about his own transformation. The lack of pain was the most disturbing part. As his body fell apart, as his organs began failing one by one, as his flesh rotted while he remained conscious, he felt nothing. No suffering, no agony, just a spreading numbness that gradually transformed into something else. Contentment. He realized, in a moment of horrified clarity, that he was happy about what was happening to him. The disease wasn't just transforming his body. It was rewiring his brain, altering his neural chemistry to make him accept and eventually embrace his condition. He was being converted, not through force or coercion, but through the simple, biological imperative of making survival pleasant rather than agonizing. The other 11 soldiers suffered similar transformations over the next several hours. Their protective suits became prisons, sealed environments where they could watch themselves decay without being able to do anything about it. They communicated via Vox links, comparing symptoms, trying desperately to find some way to resist or reverse the infection. But resistance became increasingly difficult as the contentment spread. One by one, they stopped trying to cure themselves and started exploring their new conditions, fascinated by the biological changes occurring within their bodies. They discussed the different plague strains they could feel multiplying inside them, compared notes on which organs were failing and in what sequence, speculated about what further transformations might be coming. By the time they reached the source of the infection, a massive garden at the planet's equator where diseases grew like plants and sickness blossomed like flowers, they had stopped thinking of themselves as victims and started identifying as blessed recipients of Nurgle's gifts. The garden was beautiful in its own twisted way. Massive trees grew from soil enriched with the decomposed bodies of millions, their branches heavy with fruits that pulsed with infectious life. Flowers bloomed in colors that shouldn't exist, their petals made of living tissue that wept infectious fluids. Rivers flowed with liquids that were simultaneously blood and water and industrial waste, supporting ecosystems of impossible organisms. At the garden's center stood the being responsible for Plague Garden 7's transformation. A great unclean one of Nurgle's greater daemons, a creature of such massive size and fundamental wrongness that looking at it directly caused psychic trauma. It welcomed the soldiers like a grandfather greeting beloved grandchildren, its voice a wet, bubbling rumble that somehow conveyed genuine affection and warmth. It explained that they had been chosen, selected from among billions to receive Nurgle's blessings and join the eternal garden where nothing truly dies and all life persists in perfect, pestilent harmony. The soldiers accepted this fate with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some embraced it immediately, grateful for the gift of eternal existence even in their decayed state. Others resisted to the end, fighting against the transformation even as their bodies accepted it. But all of them, eventually, became part of Plague Garden 7's ecosystem, their minds and bodies absorbed into the greater whole of Nurgle's domain. Captain Varn, watching from orbit through surveyor feeds, made the decision to deploy exterminatus protocols. The world was clearly beyond salvation, its population converted, its very matter infected with supernatural contagion that could spread to other worlds if not contained. But the exterminatus order came too late. The infection had already spread to the Navy vessel, carried up from the surface by the surviving soldiers before they fully transformed. Within hours, the ship's crew began showing symptoms. Within days, the entire vessel had been converted into a plague ship, its halls echoing with the contented laughter of the diseased. The ship was last detected drifting toward the inner systems, following the same trajectory the original plague ships had taken when they arrived at Plague Garden 7. It's still out there somewhere, broadcasting no signals, responding to no hails, simply moving through the void with its cargo of infinite diseases, waiting to find another paradise world to transform into Nurgle's garden. But if Khorne's worlds kill you through violence, Tzeentch's worlds drive you mad through knowledge, and Nurgle's worlds trap you in eternal decay. The worlds claimed by the Dark Prince offer something, perhaps most dangerous of all, exactly what you want. Slaanesh's Daemon Worlds are places where desire has become reality, where every sensation has been amplified to impossible intensity, where pleasure and pain have merged into a single overwhelming experience that consumes everything it touches. They are realms of perfect temptation, offering fulfillment of every wish, while slowly devouring the soul of anyone who accepts their gifts. The world designated as Euphoria had been an artist colony, a place where the Imperium's creative elite came to work without the distractions of normal Imperial society. Painters, sculptors, musicians, writers, anyone whose work required intense focus and freedom from mundane concerns could apply for residency on Euphoria. The colony's charter emphasized that art should serve the Emperor, that creativity should glorify humanity's master and inspire devotion in all who witnessed it. The artists who lived there took this mission seriously, producing works of genuine beauty and spiritual power that were displayed throughout the Imperium. But art is a dangerous profession, requiring creators to explore the boundaries of human experience and emotion. And boundaries, once approached, inevitably become temptations to cross them. The artist who doomed Euphoria was a sculptor named Cain Severin, a man whose works had inspired millions and whose reputation was beyond question. He had spent 60 years creating monuments to the Emperor's glory, each piece more magnificent than the last. But recently he had encountered a problem that threatened to end his career. He had run out of inspiration. Everything he created felt derivative, repetitive, technically perfect, but spiritually empty. He had exhausted every theme, explored every emotion, perfected every technique. There was nothing left to discover within the boundaries of acceptable artistic expression. So he began to look beyond those boundaries. He started small, with sculptures that pushed against conventional aesthetics without violating doctrinal restrictions. Abstract forms that suggested rather than depicted, compositions that evoked discomfort rather than inspiration. The works were controversial but not heretical, challenging but not forbidden. The response was electric. After decades of predictable, safe art, audiences encountered something that made them feel strongly, that provoked genuine emotional reactions rather than dutiful appreciation. Cain's reputation, already considerable, reached new heights. But the satisfaction was temporary. Within months, even his transgressive works felt stale and predictable. He had found a new boundary, explored it fully, and once again run out of inspiration. He needed to go further. The next series of works violated Imperial doctrine more overtly, incorporating themes and imagery that suggested alternatives to absolute obedience to the Emperor's will. He depicted human figures in poses of ecstatic rebellion, showing faces expressing emotions that ranged from joy to anguish without the mediating presence of imperial authority. The ecclesiarchy condemned the works as spiritually dangerous, but their condemnation only increased public interest. Thousands came to view the forbidden sculptures, experiencing the thrill of encountering art that challenged their indoctrination. The works were beautiful, powerful, and deeply unsettling in ways that proper imperial art never was. Khorne became addicted to the response, to the intense emotional reactions his work provoked. He pushed further with each new piece, crossing boundaries that previous generations of artists had respected not from lack of imagination, but from understanding of the dangers. He began incorporating Xenos aesthetics into his work, studying forbidden texts that described the art of ancient, alien civilizations. He experimented with materials that resonated with psychic energy, creating sculptures that affected viewers' emotions through supernatural means. He pursued perfection with obsessive intensity, sleeping less and less, eating barely enough to survive, pouring all his life energy into his work. His final masterpiece was a statue called The Ascension. It depicted a human figure in a moment of perfect transformation, caught between mortality and godhood, agony and ecstasy, creation and destruction. The figure's face expressed every emotion simultaneously. Its body suggested every possible form, its presence radiated power that was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. When Khorne unveiled The Ascension to the colony's assembled population, the statue's psychic resonance triggered a catastrophic cascade effect. Every artist who viewed it felt their own creative boundaries dissolve, their own obsessions intensify, their own pursuit of perfection amplify beyond sustainable levels. The colony descended into manic creativity. Artists worked without sleeping, without eating, without any thought for their physical well-being. They created works of stunning beauty and horrifying intensity, pieces that captured emotions so pure and powerful that viewing them could trigger madness. The warp consumed euphoria during what witnesses described as a cascade of sensation. The planet didn't simply fall into the immaterium. It was pulled in by the accumulated psychic energy of millions of creative acts, all reaching for transcendence simultaneously. The colony's entire population experienced apotheosis and damnation in the same instant, their souls consumed by the Dark Prince while their mortal forms were transformed into living embodiments of perfect, artistic expression. When euphoria emerged from the warp, it had become a monument to Slaanesh's obsession with experience, sensation, and the pursuit of perfection beyond reason. The planet's surface had been transformed into a living artwork, every mountain and valley sculpted into meaningful form, every ocean wave frozen in patterns of mathematical beauty. The surviving artists, no longer entirely human, no longer entirely alive, continued their work with inhuman intensity. They created without pause, producing masterpieces that would drive normal humans insane with their perfection. Their works radiated psychic power that could be felt across light years, calling to anyone with creative ambition or artistic sensibility. The Imperium discovered transformed euphoria when several navigators reported seeing a beacon of intense psychic energy emanating from the colony's last known location. An investigation team was assembled, led by Inquisitor Cassandra Vex, a specialist in Slaanesh corruption who had successfully contained 17 previous incidents of artistic heresy. Vex approached the mission with appropriate caution, knowing that Slaanesh's temptations were among the most insidious the Chaos Gods could offer. Where Khorne's corruption was obvious and Nurgle's repulsive, Slaanesh's gifts appeared genuinely desirable, offering fulfillment of legitimate human needs and aspirations. She assembled a team of specialists chosen specifically for their resistance to aesthetic temptation. Battle-hardened soldiers who appreciated nothing more complex than functional efficiency. Tech priests whose augmented minds processed beauty as mathematical data rather than emotional experience. Sanctioned psychers whose training had included extensive conditioning against sensory manipulation. They materialized on Euphoria's surface using teleportarium technology, appearing in what had once been the colony's central plaza. The space had been transformed into something that defied adequate description. A three-dimensional artwork that existed simultaneously as sculpture, architecture, and living organism. The ground beneath their feet was smooth as glass but warm as flesh, pulsing with rhythms that suggested heartbeat or breath. The structures surrounding them flowed like frozen water, their surfaces shifting between solid and liquid states without ever quite committing to either. Colors existed that had no names in human languages, shades that shouldn't be visible to baseline human optics but somehow registered anyway. And the sound, constant, all-pervading, beautiful beyond description. Not music exactly, but something that encompassed music while also being speech, ambient noise, and pure emotional resonance expressed as vibration. It told stories without words, conveyed concepts without language, communicated directly with the soul while bypassing the conscious mind entirely. Vex activated her psychic wards immediately, feeling the probing tendrils of corruption testing her defenses. The wards held, but she could feel the pressure building, the constant assault of sensation seeking any weakness through which to infiltrate her consciousness. Her team maintained strict tactical discipline, establishing a defensive perimeter and beginning systematic reconnaissance of the immediate area. But even their conditioning couldn't fully protect them from Euphoria's assault on the senses. The soldiers found their attention drifting, distracted by patterns in the architecture that suggested tactical significance. The tech, priests, machine spirits began producing aesthetic rather than functional analyses of their surroundings. The psychers struggled to maintain their mental shields against beauty that resonated with their psychic senses. They encountered the first transformed artist within an hour of landing. She had been a painter in her previous life, a woman named Elise Khorne, whose portraits of Imperial heroes had hung in cathedrals across 3 sectors. Now she was something else, a living canvas upon which emotions and experiences played out in real time, her skin displaying images that changed with each passing moment. She welcomed them with genuine warmth, her voice carrying harmonics that made every word feel significant and profound. She explained that the colony had achieved transcendence, that they had finally broken through the artificial limitations Imperial doctrine placed on human potential. They had discovered that humanity was capable of so much more than mere survival and obedience, that the species' true destiny lay in the pursuit of experience and perfection. "Look at what we've created," she said, gesturing to the impossible architecture surrounding them. "Look at what human genius can accomplish when freed from artificial constraints. Every building is a masterpiece, every street a symphony, every moment a work of art more perfect than anything created in 10,000 years of Imperial history." Vex listened with growing horror, recognizing the classic patterns of Slaaneshi corruption in Khorne's words. The artist genuinely believed she had achieved enlightenment, that her transformation represented progress rather than damnation. She saw no contradiction between her current state, her body warped beyond recognition, her soul clearly bound to demonic entities, and her claims of having achieved human potential. "Join us," Khorne continued, her tone shifting from explanation to invitation. "You feel it already, I can see it in your eyes. The beauty here calls to something deep within you, something that Imperial conditioning tried to suppress but could never fully eliminate. The desire for meaning beyond duty, the hunger for experience beyond mere survival, the need to create something that will outlast your brief mortal existence." The words struck deeper than Vex wanted to admit. She had spent her entire adult life serving the Inquisition, sacrificing personal happiness and human connection in pursuit of duty. She had witnessed horrors that would break normal minds, endured loneliness that would drive others to despair, all in service to an Imperium that would never know her name or appreciate her sacrifices. Part of her, a small, suppressed part she had never acknowledged, wondered what her life might have been if she had chosen differently, if she had pursued personal fulfillment instead of duty, if she had allowed herself to experience beauty and pleasure instead of dedicating every moment to hunting heretics. Khorne sensed the moment of weakness and pressed her advantage. "I was like you once," she said softly. Devoted to duty, certain of my purpose, convinced that sacrifice was noble and self-denial virtuous. But I was lying to myself. We all were. The Imperium teaches us to fear pleasure because pleasure leads to self-awareness, and self-awareness leads to questions about why we accept lives of endless suffering. She extended her hand, and on her palm appeared an image, a vision of what Vex's life could be if she accepted Slaanesh's gifts. A version of herself freed from duty and obligation, pursuing knowledge and experience without limits, creating works of insight and beauty that would genuinely help humanity rather than merely maintaining its oppression. It was tempting, more tempting than Vex had anticipated. The vision showed her everything she had secretly wanted but never allowed herself to pursue. Happiness, fulfillment, the satisfaction of creating rather than merely destroying, a legacy beyond simply being another name on the Inquisition's casualty lists. But Vex had not survived 17 encounters with Slaaneshi corruption through accident. She recognized the temptation for what it was, a lie wrapped in truth, poison disguised as medicine. Everything Khorne showed her was real, in a sense. She could achieve those things, but the cost would be her soul, her humanity, her ability to distinguish between genuine fulfillment and addictive corruption. She activated her Force sword and struck Khorne down in a single fluid motion, the blessed blade disrupting the demonic energies that sustained the artist's transformed body. Khorne's final expression was not anger or fear, but pity, as if Vex had rejected salvation rather than resisting damnation. The rest of the mission proceeded with brutal efficiency. Vex's team systematically destroyed every artwork they encountered, reducing Euphoria's impossible beauty to rubble and ash. They purged transformed artists with bolter fire and blessed blades, offering the Emperor's mercy to those too far gone to save. But the corruption had already done its damage. 2 of her soldiers deserted during the mission, overwhelmed by visions of lives they could have lived if not bound by Imperial service. One tech, Priest's machine's spirit, became so corrupted by aesthetic obsession that the entire unit had to be purged and replaced. A psyker's mental shields collapsed under the sustained assault of sensation, and she had to be executed before her possessed form could endanger the rest of the team. Vex herself survived, but the experience left scars that would never fully heal. She had glimpsed what she could have been, what she had sacrificed in service to the Emperor's will. The knowledge didn't make her doubt her choices. Her faith remained absolute. But it introduced a note of melancholy to her existence that had never been there before. She filed her report with characteristic thoroughness, documenting every detail of Euphoria's transformation and recommending immediate exterminatus to prevent further corruption. The world was too dangerous to exist, its very presence a threat to any human who possessed creative ambition or artistic sensibility. But she also included a personal note, sealed under her own inquisitorial authority and marked for her eyes only. In that note, she acknowledged the terrible truth that her encounter with Khorne had revealed, that Slaanesh's corruption was so effective precisely because it offered genuine fulfillment, that the Dark Prince's promises were lies only in their ultimate consequences, not in their immediate delivery. The Imperium demanded sacrifice, Slaanesh offered reward, and the fact that those rewards inevitably led to damnation didn't make them any less real or desirable in the moment they were experienced. That Vex realized was what made Slaanesh's Daemon World so dangerous. They didn't just tempt you with false promises. They delivered on those promises, gave you exactly what you wanted, and only slowly revealed the price you had paid for your desires. The Exterminatus fleet arrived 3 weeks after Vex's investigation concluded. They subjected Euphoria to cyclonic torpedo bombardment, reducing its surface to molten slag and disrupting the demonic energies that sustained its impossible architecture. The planet's atmosphere ignited, burning away centuries of accumulated corruption in a cleansing fire that could be seen from neighboring systems. But even as Euphoria died, its legacy persisted. Rumors spread throughout the sector about the artist colony that had achieved transcendence, about the beauty that had been destroyed by fearful Imperial authorities, about the potential that humanity could achieve if freed from the Imperium's restrictions. Those rumors found fertile ground in the hearts of creative individuals across dozens of worlds. Artists, musicians, writers, anyone whose work required them to push boundaries and explore new territory. They heard the stories and wondered whether their own limitations were necessary or merely imposed by authorities afraid of human potential. Some of them began their own experiments, testing boundaries, exploring forbidden themes, seeking the same transcendence that Euphoria's artists had supposedly achieved. Most were caught by local authorities and executed as heretics. But a few succeeded in their transformations, becoming nexus points for further corruption. Slaanesh's influence spread through art and culture, infiltrating Imperial society through the same creative impulses that made civilization possible. Each artist who fell to corruption created works that inspired others to follow. Each musician who embraced forbidden harmonies composed pieces that called to listeners' suppressed desires. Each writer who explored heretical themes planted seeds of doubt in readers' minds. The corruption was insidious, difficult to detect and nearly impossible to fully eliminate. It spread through beauty and inspiration, through legitimate human needs and aspirations. It promised freedom and delivered damnation, but the freedom came first and the damnation only gradually, allowing corruption to take root before its victims realized what they had accepted. Vex spent the rest of her career hunting manifestations of that corruption, destroying artworks and executing artists whose works showed signs of demonic influence. She became known as the Iconoclast, feared by creative communities across a dozen sectors, responsible for more cultural purges than any other living Inquisitor. But late at night, in moments of rare introspection, she sometimes wondered whether she was truly serving humanity or merely preserving its chains. Whether the Imperium's brutal suppression of artistic freedom was necessary for survival or simply a tool to maintain control over populations that might otherwise question their subjugation. She never spoke these thoughts aloud, never recorded them anywhere they might be discovered. But they remained with her, a constant whisper of doubt that Corvain's final expression had planted in her mind. The pity in those dying eyes, the certainty that Vex had chosen slavery over freedom, survival over transcendence. That was the final cruelty of Slaanesh's corruption. Even resistance left scars, even victory came with costs. The Daemon Worlds of the Dark Prince didn't need to convert you to damage you. Simply encountering them, simply glimpsing the possibilities they offered, was enough to introduce doubt that would never fully heal. And so the cycle continued. Daemon Worlds persisted throughout the galaxy, monuments to the Chaos God's eternal hunger for mortal souls. Each one represented a different face of damnation, a different path to destruction disguised as salvation. Khorne's worlds offered strength through violence, promising power to those who embraced endless war. They delivered on that promise, transforming victims into unstoppable warriors. But the strength came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Rage became not just a tool but an addiction, violence not just a means but an end in itself. Those who survived long enough on Khorne's worlds eventually became nothing more than killing machines, incapable of any thought or emotion beyond the desire for blood. Tzeentch's worlds offered knowledge through transformation, promising understanding to those who embraced change and complexity. They delivered on that promise, granting insights into reality's deepest mysteries. But the knowledge came at the cost of sanity and stability. Understanding became not just a gift, but a curse, awareness not just enlightenment, but torture. Those who survived long enough on Tzeentch's worlds eventually became lost in infinite complexity, unable to act because every action spawned infinite consequences. Nurgle's worlds offered peace through acceptance, promising relief from suffering to those who embraced decay and disease. They delivered on that promise, removing pain and fear and replacing them with contentment, but the peace came at the cost of transformation into something that could no longer be called living. Existence became not just eternal but stagnant, survival not just guaranteed but meaningless. Those who survived long enough on Nurgle's worlds eventually stopped being individuals and became merely components of a greater whole, their identities absorbed into the plague god's eternal garden. Slaanesh's worlds offered fulfillment through experience, promising satisfaction to those who embraced sensation and pursued perfection. They delivered on that promise, providing pleasures and achievements beyond mortal capacity, but the fulfillment came at the cost of ever-escalating need. Satisfaction became not just temporary but impossible, desire not just motivation but torment. Those who survived long enough on Slaanesh's worlds eventually consumed themselves in pursuit of experiences that could never quite match the intensity of their previous highs. Each path led to damnation, each promise contained poison, each gift came wrapped in chains. The Imperium's response to Daemon Worlds reflected its general approach to problems it couldn't solve: destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Standard protocol called for immediate exterminatus upon confirmation of daemonic transformation, the deployment of sufficient firepower to render the planet lifeless and its corruption contained. But exterminatus, for all its terrible finality, couldn't truly destroy Daemon Worlds. The physical planets could be reduced to rubble, their atmospheres burned away, their surfaces melted into slag, but the immaterial aspects, the psychic resonance, the daemonic presence, the corruption that had soaked into reality itself, persisted beyond mere physical destruction. Daemon Worlds existed partially in the materium and partially in the warp. Destroying their physical form simply pushed them fully into the immaterium, where they continued to exist as pure manifestations of their patron god's power. They became staging grounds for daemonic incursions, launching points for invasions of real space, eternal monuments to the chaos god's hatred of humanity. Some Inquisitors argued for alternative approaches: quarantine rather than destruction, study rather than immediate purging. Perhaps understanding how worlds fell to corruption could help prevent future transformations. Perhaps analyzing daemonic architecture could reveal weaknesses that might be exploited. These arguments were inevitably rejected by more orthodox factions, who rightly pointed out that any extended contact with Daemon Worlds inevitably led to corruption. You couldn't study damnation without risking your own soul. You couldn't analyze evil without being influenced by it. Better to destroy everything and accept the loss than risk spreading corruption through well-intentioned investigation. And so the Imperium continued its eternal war against the Daemon Worlds, destroying them when possible, quarantining them when destruction proved impossible, losing countless souls to corruption while barely holding the line against an enemy that couldn't be truly defeated. The tragedy was that every Daemon World had once been an Imperial colony, every corrupted population had once been loyal citizens. The transformation from paradise to hell never happened overnight, but rather through gradual compromise and incremental corruption. A small prayer to the wrong entity, a minor violation of doctrine that seemed harmless, a single moment of weakness that opened the door to forces that could never be fully expelled. Captain Varn understood this as he watched the tainted members of his crew turn on each other in the corridors of his ship. He had thought himself experienced, prepared, resistant to corruption through decades of faithful service. But a single moment of curiosity, a brief exposure to Plague Garden 7's influence, had been enough to doom his entire vessel. Inquisitor Martikov had understood it as she gazed upon the equations that would fragment her consciousness across multiple timelines. She had thought herself disciplined, intelligent, capable of resisting temptation through superior willpower. But a single moment of pride, a brief certainty that she was different from previous victims, had been enough to destroy everything she had built. Inquisitor Vex understood it as she struck down the artist who offered her everything she had secretly wanted. She had thought herself faithful, devoted, immune to corruption through absolute commitment to duty. But a single moment of doubt, a brief glimpse of roads not taken, had been enough to plant seeds that would never fully die. The lesson was always the same: no one was immune. No amount of faith protected you completely. No degree of discipline guaranteed safety. The Daemon Worlds existed as proof that humanity's virtues, curiosity, creativity, ambition, desire, could be weaponized against itself, that the very qualities that made humans capable of greatness also made them vulnerable to corruption. The only true protection was ignorance, and ignorance could only be maintained through constant vigilance and systematic suppression of anything that might lead to dangerous questions. The Imperium's brutal authoritarianism, its suppression of knowledge and artistic expression, its rigid doctrine and inflexible hierarchy, all of it existed not out of arbitrary cruelty, but out of hard-won understanding of how easily humanity could fall. Every freedom was a potential vector for corruption. Every question might lead to heresy. Every innovation could become the seed of demonic transformation. Better to live in chains than risk the freedom that led inevitably to damnation. That was the true horror of the Daemon Worlds. Not just what they were, but what they represented. They were monuments to human potential realized through corruption, demonstrations of what humanity could achieve if it abandoned the restrictions that kept it barely functioning within acceptable parameters. They showed that humans could transcend their limitations and become something greater, and that such transcendence inevitably led to transformation into something that could no longer be called human. They proved that there were fates worse than death, states of existence where consciousness persisted, but meaning had been evacuated. Survival guaranteed, but everything worth surviving for had been lost. The galaxy contained billions of habitable worlds, each one a potential target for demonic corruption. The Imperium's forces were spread impossibly thin, defending against threats from every direction, while simultaneously maintaining internal order across millions of planets. They couldn't protect everyone. They couldn't prevent every transformation. They could only respond after corruption had taken root, destroy what could be destroyed, and accept the loss of what couldn't be saved. Somewhere in the galaxy right now, on some quiet Imperial world where citizens go about their daily lives without suspecting the horrors that lurk beyond their understanding, the first seeds of corruption are being planted. A scholar discovering forbidden knowledge. An artist pushing beyond acceptable boundaries. A soldier discovering pleasure in violence. A doctor developing compassion for suffering that should be endured rather than relieved. Each of them thinks they're different, special, capable of handling temptations that destroyed others. Each of them believes they can take just one step beyond the boundaries and pull back before going too far. Each of them is certain that their faith, their discipline, their intelligence will protect them from the consequences of their curiosity. And each of them is wrong. The corruption will spread slowly at first, barely noticeable, easily dismissed as personal eccentricity or harmless exploration. But corruption never remains harmless. It grows, multiplies, spreads to others who are similarly convinced of their unique resistance. Within years, perhaps decades, the entire world will have been transformed, another paradise becoming another hell, another imperial colony becoming another Daemon world. the Imperium will detect the change eventually. They will dispatch investigation teams who will file reports documenting the extent of corruption. Those reports will reach Inquisitors, who will make the difficult decision to destroy an entire world to prevent the corruption from spreading further. Cyclonic torpedoes will rain from orbit, reducing cities to rubble and populations to ash. The planet will burn, its atmosphere igniting and purifying fire that consumes everything it touches. Within hours, all evidence of human habitation will be eliminated, leaving only a dead rock circling its star. And the Imperium will mark another world lost to chaos, add another entry to the endless lists of failures and catastrophes, and move on to the next crisis. They will learn nothing from the loss because there is nothing to learn. The mechanisms of corruption are well understood, the paths to damnation clearly documented. The problem isn't lack of knowledge, but lack of solutions. You can't defeat an enemy that offers what people genuinely want. You can't protect populations from temptations that speak to legitimate human needs. You can't maintain absolute control over billions of individuals across millions of worlds while simultaneously fighting wars on every front. The best the Imperium can hope for is to slow the rate of loss, to destroy Daemon Worlds faster than new ones form, to maintain some semblance of human civilization in the face of forces that seek its utter annihilation. It's not enough. It has never been enough, but it's all humanity has, and so the struggle continues, day after day, century after century, millennium after millennium. The Daemon Worlds wait, patient and eternal, knowing that eventually every soul will be tested and found wanting. Knowing that no amount of faith or discipline can permanently protect against corruption. Knowing that they have infinity to work with, while humanity has only the brief span of mortal existence. Khorne's worlds wait for warriors to discover joy in violence. Tzeentch's worlds wait for scholars to pursue knowledge beyond wisdom. Nurgle's worlds wait for the suffering to accept peace through decay. Slaanesh's worlds wait for creators to pursue perfection beyond reason. And somewhere in the galaxy, right now, the next victim is taking their first step toward damnation, convinced that they will be different, that they will succeed where others failed, that their strength or wisdom or faith will protect them from the fate that awaits all who venture too close to the abyss. They are wrong, of course. They have always been wrong. They will always be wrong. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is no salvation from chaos. There is only eternal vigilance, temporary resistance, and the certain knowledge that eventually, inevitably, every defense will fail and every soul will face the choice between damnation and destruction. The Daemon Worlds are patient. They can wait. They have all of eternity, and humanity has only moments left before the next world falls. The galaxy burns, and the darkness grows deeper with each passing day.